They say time reveals all things: truth, betrayal, even the lies we tell ourselves to keep moving forward. I never thought I'd be the kind of man blindsided by the person I trusted most. But life has a cruel sense of humor. One night, at a college reunion that should have been nothing more than nostalgia and laughter, I saw my world start to crack. And the worst part? I didn't even realize it at the time. I'm 57 years old, and for 26 years, I've been married to the woman who was the love of my life. Let's call her Lucy. We weren't just husband and wife, we were best friends. College sweethearts who had weathered the tests of time, distance, and life's endless unpredictability. Before marriage, we had spent a decade knowing each other, 2 years as friends, a year of me pursuing her, and 7 years of dating, some of which were long distance. If our love could survive that, I thought it could survive anything. Lucy wasn't just the mother of my children. She was the one who understood me better than anyone else ever had. That's why what happened shattered me. A week ago, Lucy and I attended our college reunion. Every year, our alma mater holds a grand event for the class that graduated 35 years ago, a spectacle complete with celebrities, performers, and a crowd eager to relive their youth. This year, it was our turn. We were excited, not just for the event itself, but because, out of all the couples that had formed in our college days, we were one of the few who had stayed together. In a way, we felt like the living proof that college romances didn't have to fade away. Walking into that reunion, I had no idea I was stepping into a trap of my own making. The night started out exactly as we had hoped: warm embraces, drinks flowing, and stories being swapped with old friends. It was the kind of night that makes you forget the years that have passed, where faces blur together between who they were then and who they are now. Then came Rick. If you ask anyone from our class about Rick, they'd remember him for one thing: his relentless pursuit of Lucy. While most guys admired her from afar, took their shot, and moved on, Rick was different. He never moved on. It didn't matter that she was with me, that she had chosen me, or that he was clearly out of her league. He just didn't quit. Even after Lucy and I got married, Rick made his feelings clear. The day he found out, he sent me a text. "Lucy made a mistake. I hope you take care of her the way I would have." I laughed it off back then, treating it as nothing more than the ramblings of a sore loser. But looking back, maybe I should have taken it more seriously. For 35 years, we hadn't heard a word from him. And yet, here he was, walking up to us like time had never passed. He greeted everyone warmly, but when it came to Lucy, she only offered a handshake. Something about his gaze unsettled her. It wasn't just admiration, it was fixation. He took a seat directly across from her, his eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. Trying to break the awkwardness, I asked if he had brought his family along. His answer was short: "I'm single." Apparently, he had been married once, briefly, in his 40s. When I offered the polite response, "I'm sorry to hear that," he let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, you should be sorry. You stole my love." Then he burst into hysterical laughter. Had we been younger, I might have been tempted to knock him down a peg. But at our age, men like Rick weren't worth the energy. He wasn't intimidating, just pathetic. The room grew uncomfortable, people shifted in their seats, and the moment passed without further escalation. But I noticed something. Lucy had gone quiet. Nancy, one of our closest college friends, saw it too. She pulled Lucy aside, and together we tried to brush it off, reminding her that Rick had always been a bit unhinged. But Rick wasn't done. He approached again, suddenly apologetic. He claimed he hadn't meant to upset Lucy. He just wanted to remind her that she was still admired, that despite the years, she still had a place in someone's heart. I'd had enough. "Back off," I told him. Lucy echoed my sentiment, firmly asking him to leave us alone. But Rick, ever the dramatist, insisted he was only looking for forgiveness, so we could all enjoy the last gathering of our lives. Maybe it was the nostalgia of the night, or maybe it was my own naivety, but something about that statement made me decide to just move forward. This was, after all, the final chance for all of us to come together as a class before time pulled us apart for good. Holding on to old grudges seemed pointless. Lucy hugged him, a gesture of closure. "It's time to move on, Rick." And just like that, the night continued. The music started up again, and we all hit the dance floor. Drinks were poured, jokes were shared, and it felt, for a while, like the night had been salvaged. I saw Lucy laughing with Nancy as Rick danced beside them in a ridiculous, exaggerated way, playing up his usual antics. At the time, I thought nothing of it, but looking back I should have. Because that night wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of the end. They say that betrayal is a slow poison, creeping through the veins of trust, paralyzing everything it touches. But what they don't tell you is that it doesn't always strike like lightning. Sometimes it starts with something small, a glance, a word, a touch, and before you know it, the damage is done. I didn't realize it that night. I thought I was walking away from a problem that had been resolved. Instead, I had just walked straight into the wreckage of my own marriage. After the initial tension with Rick, I was relieved to see Lucy enjoying herself again. I kept an eye on them just to be sure, but nothing seemed off. Rick whispered something in her ear, and she smiled, nodding at him. I told myself it was nothing inappropriate. If it were, Lucy would have reacted differently. That small reassurance allowed me to finally relax and enjoy the night with my friends. It wasn't until about an hour later that I noticed Lucy and Nancy were missing. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were all mingling in different groups, catching up on old times. But as the minutes passed and they didn't return, a nagging feeling crept up my spine. Something wasn't right. I pulled out my phone and tried calling them. No answer. The music was loud, so maybe they didn't hear it. But 30 minutes passed, and still they were nowhere to be seen. Then Lucy reappeared. She looked the same, at least physically. But something about her was off. Her eyes had lost their light, and her movements were mechanical, like she was just going through the motions. She barely spoke and kept urging me to leave. It was completely out of character for her. Lucy was the one who usually had to drag me away from events, never the other way around. Nancy returned shortly after, but something between them had shifted. The two of them, who had always been inseparable, didn't exchange a single word for the rest of the night. They wouldn't even make eye contact. I knew something had happened. I kept pressing Lucy for an answer, but she wouldn't say a word. Every time I asked if she was okay, she just nodded and muttered that she was tired. But I knew better. I knew when something was weighing on her. The drive home was silent. Over an hour of nothing but the sound of the road and my thoughts racing. I asked if it had anything to do with Nancy. Another short, meaningless, "No." Nothing else. No explanation, no reassurance. Just silence. By the time we got home, our friends were still buzzing online, posting pictures, sharing memories, joking about how it might be the last time we'd all be together like this. It should have been a happy night. A perfect memory. But while they were laughing, Lucy was slipping into bed, eyes shut tight, pretending to be asleep. I didn't push her. I told myself she was just exhausted. I convinced myself that whatever had happened wasn't important, that she would tell me in the morning. I was a fool. At some point in the middle of the night, I felt a shift in the bed. Then, warmth against my chest. Lucy was crying. Silent tears soaked my shirt as she rested her head against me. I wrapped my arms around her, confused but comforting her the best I could. Are you feeling emotional about seeing everyone again? I whispered. She didn't answer. She just kept crying. I held her tighter, letting her get it out. It wasn't unusual for Lucy to get sentimental about things, but something about this felt different. Then, just as the tears began to slow, she finally spoke. And her words shattered everything I believed about us. I cheated on you, she whispered. My body went numb. The world around me seemed to freeze. I didn't react. I couldn't. My mind was too busy trying to make sense of what I had just heard. She started explaining, talking as if she needed to get everything out before I could stop her, before I could look at her differently. She told me how Rick had spent the night apologizing for embarrassing her, how he had showered her with compliments, telling her that in all his years of traveling, he had never met a woman like her, that she was extraordinary, that he had never stopped loving her. She believed him. She fell for his words, his performance, his manipulations. When he asked her to take a walk with him, she initially declined. But he pushed, saying that this would be their last encounter, that she at least owed him the chance to say how he really felt. And she agreed. Out on the college lawn, he poured his heart out. He told her how he had loved her since they were young, how he had regretted every moment they weren't together. He called her the most incredible woman on earth, and she let herself believe it. Lucy admitted that she had been drinking, that she wasn't thinking clearly. But even then, she didn't stop him when he took her hand. Instead, she felt something else, relief, as if some invisible weight had lifted off her shoulders. Then, she told me what happened next. I won't repeat the details. I don't need to. All I know is that my wife, the woman I had loved for more than half my life, had betrayed me. She said that somewhere in the middle of it, her guilt caught up to her, that she pushed him away, realizing what she was doing. But by then, it was already too late. She looked at me, waiting for a reaction, hoping for something. But I had nothing. My mind was blank. My heart was breaking. I needed a moment. She kept crying, kept apologizing, but I wasn't even sure if I was still breathing. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just one drunken slip-up. This was the end of everything I thought we were. They say betrayal doesn't just break your heart, it rewrites your entire past. One moment, you believe you have a life built on love, trust, and years of shared memories. The next, you realize that everything you held sacred was nothing more than an illusion. And when the illusion shatters, you're left standing in the ruins, wondering what was ever real. I told Lucy to go to sleep. There was nothing more to say that night. She clung to me, terrified of losing me, whispering apologies between exhausted sobs. But I didn't respond. I just closed my eyes and let silence settle between us. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't understanding. It was simply the weight of reality crushing down on me. I lay there in the dark, my mind replaying the night over and over, like a film I couldn't shut off. And then, somewhere in the haze of my thoughts, I remembered something that sent a surge of rage through my veins. Rick. That smug, self-satisfied grin he had given me when Lucy returned from their so-called walk. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but now I understood. That was his victory smile. His silent way of saying, I finally won. My stomach twisted in disgust. I couldn't do this. I couldn't lie next to her, sharing the same bed, pretending for even a second that this was something we could ever come back from. She had finally drifted into a deep sleep, her body worn out from hours of crying. I got up quietly, gathered my essentials, laptop, wallet, a few clothes, and packed them into a backpack. No dramatic exit. No final words. Just me, walking out the door of the home we had built together for 26 years. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay. I checked into a hotel, pulled out my phone, and blocked her number. Then I went through all her social media accounts, cutting off every digital thread that connected us. If I had stayed until morning, she would have begged me to reconsider. She would have found a way to convince me, to make me doubt my own emotions, to tell me it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. But I knew her, and I knew myself. If I let her speak, I might falter, and I couldn't afford that. The sun was already rising by the time I finally managed to fall asleep. A few hours later, around 8 or 9 a.m., my phone started ringing non-stop. I ignored it at first, but when I saw my children's names flashing on the screen, I knew I had to answer. Our son is 24, our daughter 21. Both of them are in college, living on the same campus. They had no idea what had just happened, and I knew if I didn't pick up, they'd panic and call the police, thinking I had gone missing. I took a deep breath and called my son first. Between the two, he's always been the more level-headed, the one who could handle bad news without immediately spiraling. There was no easy way to say it, so I just told him the truth. "Your mother cheated on me last night," I said. "With Rick." Silence. Then disbelief. He kept repeating, "That can't be right," as if saying it enough times would change the reality. I could hear the wheels turning in his head, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. He wanted details. He wanted everything laid out, step by step, like a puzzle he could piece together. But I couldn't do that to him. He didn't need to know every painful detail of how his mother betrayed our family. I told him the basics. She admitted it. There was no misunderstanding. He still struggled to accept it. "But you and Mom," he started, his voice cracking. "You guys were solid. Everyone looked up to your marriage." I sighed. "Yeah, we were." He promised not to tell his sister until I was ready to speak with her. For now, I sent her a simple text saying I was out of town due to work stress. It wasn't the best lie, but it bought me time. So now the situation was this. My daughter thought I was on a business trip. My son knew the truth. And Lucy? She knew she had destroyed everything. Over the next few days, I avoided all contact with her. I spent hours online, researching divorce lawyers, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when I stumbled across an online community where men shared their own experiences with betrayal. Stories of revenge, of calculated exposure, of people setting traps for their cheating spouses before dropping the hammer. I understood their anger. I really did. But that wasn't me. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to destroy Lucy's life. I still loved her. And that was the worst part. Because even knowing what she had done, I knew that reconciliation wasn't an option. The woman I had built a life with, the woman who had been my best friend, my partner in everything, she wasn't that woman anymore. I wasn't sure how I was going to get through this. But I knew I had to. I had an appointment with a lawyer the next day. And that was the first step toward the rest of my life. They say life can change in a single moment. 1 second, you're planning a future with a person you love. The next, you're planning how to move on without them. And the strangest part? You still catch yourself thinking about them, about what could have been, even when you know there's no going back. I realized I left out some important details. Both Lucy and I were management consultants before we left our full-time jobs in our late 40s. Lucy had always wanted to be a writer, and when she finally had the chance, I supported her. Meanwhile, I became a business consultant for startups, working independently. My job doesn't tie me to a single office. I work from home, visit clients, and manage multiple projects at once. This flexibility has worked in my favor. Since I cut contact with Lucy, she hasn't been able to track me down. For years, we had been planning our retirement together. We saved aggressively, dreaming of a beach house in the countryside, a peaceful place where we would spend the rest of our lives. Next year was supposed to be the year we made that dream a reality. We had even started scouting properties, speaking to owners, and mapping out our future. Looking back now, I'm grateful we never made the purchase. That house was meant to be our sanctuary, but now I can't imagine anything more suffocating than being tied to a place that was meant for a life that no longer exists. Since I left, Lucy has been trying relentlessly to reach me. Calls, messages, emails, I haven't responded to a single one. I met with my lawyer the day after my initial post, and we discussed the best way to proceed. He advised me to inform my children about the separation, given that they are adults. We also discussed dividing our assets, and I made my decision. I wouldn't punish Lucy financially. She was entitled to half of everything we built together, just as she was entitled to this separation, something she had earned through her own choices. I knew her well enough to predict her next move. She would likely try to give up her claim to our assets in an attempt to reconcile, to convince me to rebuild what was broken. But I knew better. While the divorce paperwork was being finalized, I arranged to meet with my children. I asked my son to bring his sister to a restaurant without telling her I would be there. He agreed. The moment my daughter saw me, she unleashed a flood of questions. Her face was red, her eyes already filled with anger. "Are you cheating on Mom?" she demanded. That question stung, but I understood why she asked it. She knew I had cut off all contact with Lucy. In her mind, I had left without explanation. I let her get it all out before I answered. Then, in the calmest way I could, I told him the truth. My son already knew about the affair, but he had no idea what my next steps were. My daughter, on the other hand, was devastated. She had spent the last 15 days living with Lucy, completely unaware of what had happened. She hugged me, tears running down her face. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered. Then came the question I had been dreading. "Can't you forgive her? Can't you at least try?" I shook my head. "No," I said firmly. "I'm filing for divorce." They both broke down. Watching them cry felt like being stabbed in the chest, but they understood. They saw my pain. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I knew I wasn't alone. I reassured them that while I was separating from their mother, I would never separate from them. No matter what, I was still their father. That would never change. Then my daughter told me something that I had suspected but hadn't wanted to hear. "Mom hasn't been eating or sleeping properly. She's been crying nonstop and pacing around the house, trying to call you. She even drove to some of your clients' offices to ask where you were, but no one had seen you in 2 weeks." When my daughter confronted Lucy, asking what had happened between us, Lucy didn't answer. She just locked herself in her room and cried. I told my daughter to stay with her mother until the divorce was finalized. I could see their sorrow slowly shifting into something else, anger. I didn't want that. I didn't want them to hate their mother. Yes, Lucy had destroyed our family, but she was still their mom. They had already lost the image of the perfect family they thought they had. I wouldn't let them lose their relationship with her too. Then, something happened that made my blood boil. I received a text from Rick. "If you're really planning on divorcing Lucy, I'm willing to take her." I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond. In the end, I sent back a single line. "Lucy is a free woman. She can make her own choices." Then I blocked him. I knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to provoke me, to get a reaction. But I felt nothing. No anger. No jealousy. Nothing. Because at the end of the day, Rick wasn't the one who broke my trust. I didn't love or trust him. Lucy did. And that was what hurt the most. The divorce papers were sent out today. Now, I'm just waiting for my daughter's call, for news on Lucy's reaction. In the meantime, I have a life to rebuild. My assets, my retirement, my children's future. One step at a time. They say love and hate are two sides of the same coin. But what no one tells you is that the worst feeling isn't either. It's the emptiness that comes when someone you cherish betrays you. When the trust you built over decades crumbles in an instant, and all that remains is a hollow space where love used to be. I apologize for the delay. I've had a long list of things to take care of. First and foremost, my divorce is finalized. When Lucy received the papers, she broke. Up until that moment, she had been living in denial, convincing herself that I was just angry and would eventually come back to her. That illusion shattered the second she held those documents in her hands. She begged my lawyer for a meeting, but he refused. He told her she was already getting half of our assets, more than she deserved. Her response? I don't want the assets. I just want him. I told you before, I know her. She truly believed that if she could just see me, talk to me, she could change my mind. And the sad truth? She was probably right. If I had met with her, I might have faltered. I might have let my emotions get the better of me. Because, despite everything, I still loved her. I still hated seeing her suffer. But I also knew this. I could never live with myself if I set aside my self-respect. She had taken me for granted. She had destroyed our family for what? Some nostalgic fantasy with a man who had spent decades lurking in the shadows of our marriage? I refused to let her manipulate me into forgetting that. Then my daughter called. She wanted to meet urgently. When I saw her, her face was pale, her hands trembling. She told me that Lucy's condition had worsened, so much so that she had to be hospitalized. She had fallen into a deep depression, refusing to eat, refusing medication. She was put on a liquid diet because she had stopped eating altogether. I know what you might be thinking. That I'm heartless. That I never really loved her if I can stand by while she destroys herself. But if you've never been betrayed like this, you can't possibly understand. To say I loved Lucy would be an understatement. I adored her. I was her biggest supporter, her biggest fan. For almost 3 decades, she was the center of my world. And she threw it all away. Rick wasn't wrong when he said Lucy was one of a kind. She was intelligent, talented, compassionate, everything a man could want in a partner. That's why I made sure to treat her like she was special. But she betrayed me at my most vulnerable point. I never, in my worst nightmares, thought she would cheat on me. And not just with anyone, with Rick. A few days after Lucy received the divorce papers, I got a call from Nancy. She asked how I was doing, then cautiously inquired about Lucy. I'm divorcing her, I told her. She didn't sound surprised. In fact, she already knew why. But what she told me next shattered what little belief I had left in Lucy. Nancy had tried to warn her. That night at the reunion, she had pulled Lucy aside and told her not to go with Rick. She knew how obsessive he had been in the past. She knew he was dangerous, not in a violent way, but in a way that only a desperate man with nothing to lose can be. But Lucy didn't listen. Nancy described the events of that night a little differently than Lucy had. She said that while she and Lucy were dancing, Rick kept whispering things in her ear. Lucy had told me he was apologizing. But Nancy saw something else. Lucy enjoyed his attention. She didn't recoil. She didn't push him away. And when Rick suggested they take a walk, Lucy looked to Nancy for guidance. Nancy told her it was a bad idea. Lucy went anyway. At first, Nancy wasn't worried. She thought Lucy was just being polite, hearing him out one last time. But after a while, when Lucy still hadn't returned, Nancy started to feel uneasy. She went looking for them. And when she found them, they weren't on the lawn, like Lucy had told me. They were in the changing rooms of the college swimming pool. And they weren't just talking. Nancy caught them in the act. Lucy only stopped when she saw Nancy standing there. So much for her conscience kicking in. She hadn't stopped because she realized she was making a mistake. She stopped because she got caught. Until this moment, I had held on to a small, pathetic shred of respect for Lucy. I had believed her when she told me she had been drunk, that she had been manipulated, that she had pushed him away when she came to her senses. But that was a lie. She didn't cheat because she was drunk. She cheated because she wanted to. The swimming pool was at least a 15-minute walk from where we were. The changing rooms were deep inside the facility. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment mistake. She had made a deliberate choice. Nancy asked me if I could ever see myself forgiving Lucy, if I could ever give her another chance. She didn't know that Lucy had lied about what happened. I didn't answer, because at that moment, all the love I still had for Lucy died, and I lost every last ounce of respect for her. Meanwhile, my children were still struggling with the fallout. My daughter told me that Lucy was on the brink of self-harm, and for the first time since this all started, I hesitated. They say karma has a way of balancing the scales, but sometimes it doesn't come in the form of revenge or poetic justice. Sometimes it simply reveals the truth you were too blind to see. And the cruelest part? By the time you realize it, it's already too late. After hearing that Lucy was on the brink of self-harm, I called Nancy. I told her everything, that Lucy had lied to me about what really happened that night, that she had painted herself as a woman caught in the moment when, in reality, she had chosen to betray me. I asked Nancy to visit her, to have an honest conversation. Lucy had been keeping this secret locked inside, letting it fester, using her own suffering as a desperate plea for reconciliation. But I knew her. I knew she was harming herself in hopes that I would come running back to save her. I told Nancy to make one thing absolutely clear. I knew the truth, and I had no intention of ever forgiving her or taking her back. Nancy later updated me. Lucy was still weak and emotionally fragile, but she was doing better. And, finally, she had signed the divorce papers. That, at least, was a relief. With that chapter closed, I made a decision. I abandoned the idea of settling down in one place. Staying still would drive me insane. I wrapped up my work and began planning a solo journey. Some people in this community might say I didn't handle the situation as ruthlessly as I should have, that I could have played the long game and exposed Lucy in a more calculated way. Maybe they're right, but I did the best I could. What mattered now was the future. 1 year later. Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. It's been a year since my last update. I wish I could say time has flown by, but for me, it hasn't. After leaving, I spent months in a motel, then moved into a condo while finalizing the divorce. It was a slow, painful process, but eventually the dust settled. As for work, I transitioned entirely to remote clients, just as I had planned. And the money? The money Lucy and I had saved for our retirement home was split down the middle. My half, I gave to my children equally. They are responsible adults, and I know they'll put it to better use than I ever could. I don't need it. Lucy, on the other hand, she's still undergoing therapy. Nancy keeps in contact with her, occasionally checking in on me as well. And recently, she shared something that genuinely caught me off guard. Despite everything I thought I knew about Lucy, despite her betrayal, despite the years we spent together, this revelation made me question whether I ever truly knew her. Because after all the dust had settled, Lucy reached out to Rick. And Rick? He played her again. At first, he acted the same as before, sweet words, admiration, declarations of love. He told her she was still the woman he had always longed for. But then, the second he learned that our divorce was final, he ghosted her. She was devastated. She pleaded with him, reminding him of all the things he had said, of how he had promised that he truly loved her. But it turned out Rick had never planned on being with her. All he had wanted was a one-time fling. And he got it. Lucy had given up everything for a man who never wanted her. When she pressed him for answers, he admitted it outright. He told her he could never commit to a relationship with a woman as strong-willed as her. That was the moment I realized something. Lucy had thrown away our marriage, believing she was choosing passion, romance, an epic love story waiting to be fulfilled. Instead, she was just another name on Rick's list. And the worst part? She begged him to be with her. Nancy told me that Lucy humiliated herself, pleading with Rick to stay, to give their relationship a real chance. But Rick had already moved on, because he was never serious to begin with. In his final conversation with her, he didn't even bother to pretend. "You thought you were smart," he told her. "But I played you. I tricked you. Who's the clever one now?" And just like that, he was gone. That's when Lucy truly broke. Not when I left. Not when she signed the divorce papers. But when she finally realized she had destroyed her life for nothing. She had lost everything. Her marriage, her family's respect, even her own dignity, all for a man who never even cared. Some might call that karma. But for me, it was just confirmation. Lucy was never the woman I thought she was. And maybe, after all these years, I finally see her for who she really is. They say time heals all wounds. But that's a lie. Time doesn't heal anything. It just dulls the edges, makes the pain easier to carry. Some scars stay with you forever, reminders of the battles you fought, and the people you lost along the way. The last real update I received about Lucy was a couple of weeks ago. My daughter had been staying with her since I moved out, trying to provide support. But after a year of living under the same roof, she finally had enough. Lucy had changed. She was no longer the strong, emotionally resilient woman we once knew. Instead, she had become insecure, erratic, constantly seeking validation, unable to be alone. She bombarded our children with calls and messages, demanding immediate responses. When my son refused her request to move in with her, until he got married, she became upset. She tried to control my daughter's social life, pressuring her to stay home instead of going out with friends or traveling. The problem was, our children are adults now. They have lives, ambitions, dreams. They cannot be held hostage by their mother's emotional spiral. Whenever my daughter tried to address Lucy's intrusive behavior, Lucy would break down, sobbing, saying she was terrified of losing them, just as she had lost me. My children assured her that they weren't abandoning her, that they were trying their best to help her cope. But they also warned her, if she kept pushing them away, they might have to reconsider how much of a role she played in their lives. This led to arguments. Ugly ones. Lucy accused them of not supporting her during her most difficult time. That was the breaking point. They told her the truth, the thing she didn't want to hear. She was the one who destroyed our family. Hearing that from her own children crushed her. But what did she expect? She had spent her entire life being loved, supported, and admired. And in one reckless moment, she threw it all away. 2 weeks ago, my daughter moved out. She had done everything she could to help Lucy, but she couldn't sacrifice her own future in the process. And honestly, she was right to leave. Lucy needs to face her own demons. Some men in my situation might take satisfaction in seeing their cheating ex-wife suffer. Maybe if I had been in my 20s or 30s, I would have felt the same. But at nearly 60, I don't find any happiness in this. If anything, I feel sorry for her. Lucy's choices have condemned her to a lifetime of suffering. And no matter how much I try to move forward, a part of me will always wish she could find her way back to the woman she used to be, a woman who didn't need the validation of men like Rick to feel worthy. My own journey. I've spent the past year living in 4 different countries, exploring different cultures, experiencing new ways of life. At first, I was disappointed that my retirement didn't unfold the way I had envisioned. I always thought Lucy and I would grow old together in a quiet beachside home, sipping coffee in the mornings, reminiscing about our past. But that life is gone. And surprisingly, I don't regret the new path I've taken. Traveling has been a gift. I've met incredible people, seen places I never thought I would, and rediscovered passions I had long forgotten. One of them, painting. I had dabbled in art when I was younger, but life, work, marriage, responsibilities took over. Now, with the freedom to do whatever I want, I've picked up a brush again. And for the first time in years, I feel at peace. To be clear, I haven't entered into any new relationships, nor am I actively seeking one. I'm open to whatever the future holds, but right now I'm content. And for a man who once thought his life was over, that's saying something. 2.5 years later. Hello everyone. I know it's been a while. Truthfully, not much has happened in the past 2.5 years. At least, nothing dramatic. I've continued traveling, visiting more than a dozen countries, meeting new people, and immersing myself in different cultures. At first, I didn't see the point in updating this thread. This started as a story about betrayal, about my ex-wife's infidelity. It didn't seem relevant to share stories of my travels or the fact that I was painting again. But something happened recently that made me pick up my phone and write this update. Last month, after 4 years, I saw Lucy again. And the reason? My son is getting married. The reunion. He found the love of his life and decided to take the next step. 2 months before the wedding, he called me. "Dad, I want you and Mom to meet her parents before the wedding." At first, I hesitated. I suggested meeting them at the wedding itself, avoiding any unnecessary tension with Lucy. But then I realized, this wasn't about me. This was about my son. He wanted his family to show up for him, to do things the right way. And as his father, it was my responsibility to set aside my personal feelings and be there. The bride's parents invited us to dinner a week before the wedding. I hadn't confirmed my attendance, but at the last moment, I decided to go. And that's when I saw Lucy. It was strange. Seeing her in a family setting again, sitting at the same table, part of the same conversation. For a moment, it almost felt normal. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Because the woman sitting across from me? She was just a stranger now. They say time changes people, but some wounds never truly heal. For years had passed since I last saw Lucy, and now, here we were, sitting at the same table, brought together not by love, not by regret, but by duty. Our son was getting married, and for him, I was willing to set aside the past. I hadn't planned on attending this pre-wedding dinner, but at the last minute, I realized it wasn't about me. It was about being the father my son needed. Lucy looked different. Her once thick, carefully maintained hair had thinned, and the weight of the years seemed to rest heavier on her than it should have. When she greeted me with a polite smile, I could see the tension in her eyes. What surprised me was the seating arrangement. We were placed next to each other. I had a feeling our son hadn't told anyone that this would be our first real interaction in 4 years. For the most part, Lucy remained silent. But once we had a brief moment alone, she finally spoke. "You look healthier, happier," she said softly. I met her gaze for a moment before nodding. "Yeah," I replied. "Cutting toxicity out of your life does that to you." Her face fell. She glanced around, as if making sure no one else had heard my words. Then, lowering her voice, she asked, "Are you seeing anyone?" I could tell she wanted an answer, something to latch onto. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. "My relationship status isn't your concern," I said flatly. For the rest of the evening, I barely looked at her. I focused on my son, his fiancée, and the other guests. When it was time to leave, I hugged my son and his soon-to-be wife. I exchanged warm farewells with the rest of the family. But with Lucy, I simply nodded and said, "Take care." I saw the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. Maybe she had expected something more. But she was the one who had broken us. She didn't deserve anything more. As I stepped outside, my son walked with me. "Dad, why don't you stay with me for a few days?" he offered. I declined, assuring him I'd call. The truth was, I wasn't staying with family. I wasn't even staying in a permanent home. For the past 4 years, I had been living life as a nomad. A new chapter. After spending 26 years as a family man, transitioning into a solitary, ever-changing lifestyle wasn't easy. But over time, I embraced it. And I wasn't alone. 2 years ago, during a trip to Tokyo, I met Ashleen. She was 52, recently out of an abusive relationship, and on her first solo adventure. We met while hiking, striking up a conversation that turned into hours of talking about life, choices, and the freedom of rediscovery. We didn't rush anything. Neither of us was looking for romance. After Tokyo, she went to Thailand, while I traveled to South Korea. But we stayed in touch. 6 months later, we started planning our trips together. For the past year and a half, we've traveled to over 8 countries. We became companions, not just in travel but in life. We took our time, truly getting to know one another. And while neither of us wants marriage, we know what we have is real. My children know about Ashleen. But they chose not to tell Lucy, fearing it would trigger another depressive spiral. The wedding. After the pre-wedding dinner, I returned to my hotel and called my son. I told him why I had declined his offer to stay with him. "Ashleen is with me," I said, "and I don't want to leave her alone." There was a pause, then a chuckle. "So are you bringing her to the wedding?" he asked. "I want to," I admitted. "She's my partner. She should meet my family." He hesitated, not because he had an issue with it, but because he was worried about Lucy. My daughter was added to the call, and after discussing it, they both agreed. Ashleen deserved to be there. The wedding was a week away, and in that time, I showed Ashleen around Kentucky. It was her first time visiting. Then came the big day. The moment we walked into the venue, I felt it. Lucy's eyes were on me. I saw it all in her expression, the disbelief, the anger, the hurt. But it wasn't just because I was there. It was because I was holding Ashleen's hand. I had warned Ashleen that Lucy might not handle things well. But she simply squeezed my hand and said, "I can handle it." Then, I saw Lucy storming toward us. Her expression was a mixture of rage and desperation. She grabbed my wrist, trying to pull me aside. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked her in the eye and said, "I'm not having a private conversation with you." Her grip tightened for a second before she let go. Then, she demanded to know if Ashleen was my girlfriend. If I planned to marry her. I didn't owe her an explanation. But I knew, in that moment, Lucy finally understood something. She had spent 4 years stuck in the past. And I had moved on. They say every story has an ending. But the truth is, some chapters just close while life keeps going. And sometimes, the people we once held closest become nothing more than ghosts in our rearview mirror. When Lucy demanded answers about Ashleen, I kept my response simple. "It shouldn't concern you," I said. I told her to leave us alone. Guests were arriving, and people had already started noticing her tears and her anger. But Lucy wasn't thinking about the wedding. She wasn't thinking about our son, the reason we were all here. She only cared about herself. "I don't care about anyone else," she shot back. "I need to resolve this one way or another." My daughter intervened, stepping between us, trying to calm her mother down. But Lucy wasn't listening. She refused to walk away. "You're disrupting the wedding," I pointed out. Her response? "I don't care." That was it. That was the moment my daughter, my sweet, patient daughter, snapped. She didn't yell. She didn't lose control. Instead, she spoke with the kind of authority I never expected from her. In a calm, firm voice, she laid it all out. "Mom, yes, you were supposed to walk into the wedding on Dad's arm. You were supposed to be with him. But you chose some random guy instead. So either accept it and move on right now, or I will personally make sure you're kicked out of this wedding before it even begins." Lucy froze. I almost stepped in, my instinct as a father telling me to protect my daughter from the weight of this moment. But I didn't. Because she didn't need protection. She needed to say this. I felt the tension in Lucy's grip loosen. Then I saw it, the shift in her expression. Anger. Betrayal. Sadness. She held my gaze for 3 long seconds. No words were exchanged, but in that moment, I think she finally understood something. She had lost everything, and she had no one to blame but herself. Then, without another word, Lucy turned and walked away. She never introduced herself to Ashleen. Never tried to make amends. She was just gone. Moving forward. After she left, my daughter turned to Ashleen, her face full of guilt. "I'm sorry," she said. Ashleen hugged her. I reassured her. "There's nothing to apologize for. You stood up for yourself, for all of us. And I'm proud of you." My daughter nodded, but I could see the emotion weighing on her. "It's on her now, Dad," she whispered. "We've suffered enough. She needs to move on, or leave you alone." She was right. For years, Lucy had made everyone's life miserable. Yet she still expected sympathy, still thought she deserved care and attention from people who had moved on. But reality had caught up to her. Throughout the wedding, she grew increasingly withdrawn. She barely spoke to anyone. She either stood in a corner or sat alone, more excluded than any mother of the groom should have been. And when it was time for the family photos, she didn't even join us. The final goodbye. A few days later, Nancy called. She told me Lucy had taken this hard. She couldn't handle seeing me move on, seeing our children stand by my side, watching me walk into that wedding with someone new. Her ego had taken the biggest hit of all. "She keeps saying you moved on too fast," Nancy told me. I laughed. "4 years is fast?" Nancy sighed. "She expected you to come back eventually. And now, she knows you never will." "She's right about one thing," I said. "I'm done. My kids are done." We're all done with her drama. She's on her own. A new future. The wedding made me realize something. My children don't have a family home to return to for holidays, for special moments. That's on me. And while they're grown, I want to change that. I've been a nomad for years, but maybe it's time to settle, at least nearby. Maybe someday I'll become a grandfather. But one thing is for certain. I won't be sharing that future with Lucy. And I'm perfectly okay with that. Maybe Ashleen will be willing to take that step with me when the time comes. Or maybe I'll just enjoy the years I have left, one day at a time. Whatever happens next, I know one thing. Life is good, and there's always more to enjoy. For those of you reading this, stay loyal, stay true to your spouses. If not for yourself, then for your children. Because in the end, love isn't about grand gestures or passion that fades in the night. It's about respect. And once that's gone, there's no getting it back.